Maryland 1, Nebraska 6, Husker, Spring Invitational, Nebraska, Ohio State 6, Nebraska 1, Northwestern 8, Nebraska 0, NCAA Regionals, Nebraska, Purdue 0, Nebraska 17, Big Ten Championships, Nebraska, Husker, Spring Invitational, Nebraska, Minnesota, Nebraska, Northwestern 8, Nebraska 2, Purdue 4, Nebraska 13, NCAA Super Regionals, Nebraska, Big Ten Championships, Nebraska, Rutgers 4, Nebraska 3, Penn State 4, Nebraska 3, Northwestern 4, Nebraska 0, Purdue 5, Nebraska 9, Nebraska 1, Creighton 9, Creighton 10, Nebraska 2, Arkansas State 0, Nebraska 2, Nebraska Sacred Heart 0, Nebraska 2, Nebraska Crimson Tide Invitational, Nebraska Crimson Tide Invitational, Nebraska Penn State, Nebraska Purdue Lady Buckeye Spring Invitational, Nebraska Husker Invitational, Nebraska Indiana Missouri, Nebraska Iowa Red White Spring Game, Nebraska Penn State, Nebraska Purdue, Penn State, Nebraska Purdue Kansas State, Nebraska Omaha, Nebraska Big Ten Championships, Nebraska NCAA Championships, Nebraska NCAA Championships, Nebraska Minnesota, Nebraska Michigan, Nebraska Iowa Hawkeye Invitational, Nebraska Minnesota, Nebraska Colorado State, Nebraska Colorado Minnesota, Nebraska Iowa NCAA Championships, Nebraska Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska Michigan State, Nebraska Iowa, South Dakota, Nebraska Creighton, Nebraska Iowa Big Ten Tournament, Nebraska Big Ten Tournament, Nebraska Big Ten Championships, Nebraska Maryland, Nebraska Illinois, Nebraska Big Ten Championships, Nebraska Maryland, Nebraska Illinois, Nebraska Big Ten Championships, Nebraska Maryland, Nebraska Illinois, Nebraska Wisconsin, Wisconsin.